So thank you so much for having me. I wish I could be there in person in Florida. I was telling Bob and Richard earlier, Colorado's great and all, but I don't have salt marsh lagoons or anything around. So we don't. I can go out and see Woodhouse's scrub jay, but I can't see Florida scrub jay around here. So I look forward to a day when I get to actually travel again, um, and get to see some of these birds outside of my own region. We're going to be talking tonight about what birds are actually saying to one another when they speak. On your screen right now, you can see that beautiful common yellowthroat. And I am going to play sounds occasionally here. I'm going to play a sound so you can adjust your volume here. Here's the song of the yellowthroat. And hopefully that's coming in loud and clear for you. If it's not, let me know in the chat if you're having technical difficulties. Once in a while, when I am giving this talk on Zoom, sometimes if I press play on a sound, there's a delay. I hear it right away, but then the people on the other end of Zoom don't hear it right away. And then I sometimes don't realize that's happening and I start talking before the sound finishes. So let me know if that's happening via the chat during our talk tonight. Up here above my name on this slide, you see this weird set of squiggles. That is the song of that individual common yellowthroat that you just heard. That is a picture of the sound. We call it a spectrogram, and it's a computer-generated graph of the sound. It's the same basic idea as reading music. It goes from left to right. The high notes are at the top, the low notes are at the bottom. We're not going to spend any time really learning how to read spectrograms this evening, but I wanted to let you know that that was there. At certain times during the presentation tonight, you might see shapes appear on the screen when a bird is singing, and if that happens, it's a spectrogram that you're seeing. It's a picture of the sound. People sometimes ask me when I tell them I wrote a field guide to bird sounds, they say, how can you possibly write a book that illustrates sounds? And this is how. Spectrograms are how you do that. But we're going to be talking more about what the birds are actually saying to one another tonight. But I wanted to make sure that you knew what those squiggles were if you saw them. I like to say that all around us, all the time, the birds are always telling us who they are and what they're doing. The problem is that a lot of us don't speak bird. Here's one bird that's going to tell us something. That bird just told you that it's a red-winged blackbird. It also just told you that it's a male. It also told you a few other things, but we'll get to that in a moment. That bird also just told you that it's a red-winged blackbird. It told you that it's a female, and it told you a few other things, which we'll get to in a moment. We can learn the language of the birds and figure out what they're actually saying to one another. For example, that's a cliff swallow. Cliff swallows, in case you're not familiar with them, they love to nest in colonies under bridges, under culverts. They'll build their little mud nests in huge numbers. And if you walk up underneath the bridge where all the cliff swallows are nesting, they will all fly out over your head and they'll give this call. Because that little doo-doo sound is the word in cliff swallow language that means danger. But cliff swallows have some other sounds in their language as well, some other words, like this one. That is a sound that cliff swallows only make on cool, cloudy days. Because on cool, cloudy days, it becomes difficult to be a cliff swallow. Cliff swallows survive by feeding on flying swarms of insects. And when it's rainy and cool and overcast, those insects tend not to fly nearly as much. So it becomes difficult for the cliff swallows. What happens on those cool, cloudy days and rainy days is that all the cliff swallows spread out from the colony in different directions, hoping that one of them will get lucky and find a swarm of insects that's actually on the wing. And when they find one, they give this call. And that call immediately recruits all the other members of the colony within earshot to come quickly and take advantage of this food source while it's still available. Now, it's possible that other species of swallow also have food finding calls, like this cliff swallow food finding call. But if other species of swallows have these calls, we don't know about it. The only reason we know that cliff swallows have this call is because there's one researcher who kept going back and studying the same colony of cliff swallows in Nebraska every summer for 20 years. And somewhere around the 13th or 14th year that he was out there, they discovered this call and did a fairly ingenious set of experiments to demonstrate what it actually means. When I say that other swallows could have these calls, but we don't know about it, that's actually one of the most exciting things to me about learning about bird sounds, is that when you are learning about bird sounds, you are standing very close to the frontier of human knowledge. There is so much for us to learn about even the sounds of very common birds that you have in your backyard every day. I tell people it's much, much easier to go out with a recorder and record a bird sound in your backyard that's never been recorded before than it is to go out with a camera anywhere and take a photo of a bird that's never been taken before. I myself, in the, what is it now? 16, 17 years that I've been recording bird sounds, I've recorded sounds that nobody else has recorded before on a dozen or more occasions. And a lot of people can do this. We have so much to learn about even bird sounds like American robin. Like we still don't understand the structure of American robin song or the communication of American robin song. There's so much to learn. And that's one of the things that I'm going to encourage you to do tonight, is to think about ways in which you could start recording the bird sounds that you hear around you, even just with your phone, and uploading them to the internet so that other people and researchers can make use of those sounds and actually advance our knowledge of what birds are saying. So tonight, we're going to talk about the messages that birds send to one another when they're singing and calling. And we're going to start with this pair of red-winged blackbirds that we heard from earlier. We're actually going to hear from the red-winged blackbirds a couple of different times tonight, because the red-winged blackbirds are one of the birds that have really been well studied in the United States. And so we do have a pretty good handle on what they're saying to one another. And also, red-winged blackbirds are hands down the most vocally interesting birds in North America. There's a lot going on in red-winged blackbird language. So one of the things that red-winged blackbirds do is that mated pairs duet with one another. The male sings his song. He's got this konkari song that you heard earlier in this talk, and you've probably heard a whole bunch of times in the marsh, because it's a very common sound. You hear red-winged blackbirds singing this konkari song all across the country. What you may not realize is that the female red-winged blackbird also has a song of her own. It sounds very different. It sounds like cheer. And the male and the female, if they're a mated pair, they will often duet with one another. The way it works is that the male starts his song, and then halfway through his song, the female starts her song. So he starts it, they overlap for a little bit in the middle, and then she finishes it out. And because those two songs sound so different, and because they don't start exactly at the same time, they start about a half second apart. A lot of people have heard this duet many, many times and never realized it. You've probably heard it if you've spent any time in a marsh where there were breeding red-winged blackbirds, and you may not have realized you were listening to a duet. It sounds like this. And when that male and female red-winged blackbird are duetting, they are saying to one another, I love you. One of the reasons you may not have heard this duet or may not have realized that it was a duet is because when the birds are duetting, they're not necessarily right next to each other out in the open. The male might be 5 feet from the female, or he might be 50 feet from the female. He might be perched up on a stalk where you can see him, and she might be down in the reeds near the nest. And yet, if you listen when you're out in the marsh and you hear this pattern where the male starts singing and the female starts halfway through his song, especially if you're hearing it consistently like this, if you hear that, you can be confident you're listening to a mated pair. So especially if you're doing breeding bird surveys or atlas work or something like that, this is a really valuable thing to know. Incidentally, related birds in this same family, many of them do the exact same thing. Meadowlarks, both eastern and western, they do the exact same thing. The male has his song, the female has a rattle call. She starts it halfway through her mate's song. Those two birds could be 100 yards apart on the prairie, but if you're hearing that rattle call given in answer to a male song and starting in the middle of the male song, that's a mated pair. Brown-headed cowbirds do the exact same thing. The female has a rattle call. She starts it halfway through her mate's song. That's a courtship exercise right there, a pair bonding duet, just like these two red-winged blackbirds saying, I love you to one another. But when this pair of red-winged blackbirds is duetting, they're not just saying, I love you to one another. They're also sending a message to all the other red-winged blackbirds in the marsh. They're saying, I'm taken. Or more specifically, they're saying, my mate is taken. Because the male red-winged blackbird will defend his mate against other males. The female red-winged blackbird will defend her mate against other females. And so when they duet like this, they are sending a message to all the other red-winged blackbirds in the marsh that this territory is occupied by a mated pair. There's no more room for another male to come in here. There's no more room for another female on this territory. Now, male red-winged blackbirds actually have two different kinds of songs. They have the very familiar, very common konkari song, which means I love you / I'm taken. But they also have what we call a flight song. We call it a flight song because it's almost always given in flight. And it sounds quite different. We don't know 100% for sure what the flight song means, but our best guess is that it means something like this. Now that male red-winged blackbird's flight song probably sounded to you like a whole string of call notes strung together. That's pretty much exactly what it is. But each individual male has his own flight song that's unique to him, that strings call notes of different kinds together in a particular order. Usually they have a couple of those seer, high-pitched whistles in the middle with a bunch of calls before and after. We think that the main reason that male red-winged blackbirds give these flight songs is probably to notify his mate that he's leaving the territory and that she has to hold down the fort while he's gone. This is because Males usually give these flight songs when they're flying away from their territories. However, they don't give the flight song every time they fly away from their territory. And sometimes they'll give it when they're on their way back to their territory. So it's not 100% clear exactly what the flight song might mean. I see a question in the chat. Richard says, I understand that red-winged blackbird males have many nests and females that he watches over. Then what happens? That's exactly right. Male red-winged blackbirds are polygamous. So each male tries to maintain a harem of a couple different females, and yet he will still duet with those individual females that are his mates as a pair bonding opportunity. He will still defend those females against other males. He'll try to defend all of them. And those females will still try to keep other females from mating with her mate. It gets complicated in red-winged blackbird social lives. Now, the female red-winged blackbird also has two different kinds of songs that she gives. One of them is that I love you / I'm taken song that we heard a minute ago. And then she has another version of her song that she gives primarily when she is defending her territory against another female. A more aggressive version of the song sounds like this. You can hear that sounds much harsher. And that's a more aggressive version of the song. Now, female red-winged blackbirds can express themselves across an entire range of emotions because they can kind of mix and match notes from these two different songs to create mixed messages or messages that are anywhere on that spectrum in between I love you and get out of my territory. When we're talking about bird languages, sometimes one sound can have many meanings. And that's not too surprising because human language works the exact same way. In English, we have a bunch of words that sound the same, but they mean different things. And when that happens in English, we figure out which meaning is intended from listening to the context. Birds do the exact same thing. So for example, here's a little ruby-crowned kinglet. And in the summertime, up in the mountains or in the boreal forest, this male ruby-crowned kinglet sings a long, complex, beautiful song. But in the wintertime, down on the wintering grounds, ruby-crowned kinglets don't say much. They just basically say this one call note over and over again. Chit, 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 it. That's pretty much the only call that you're likely to hear from a ruby-crowned kinglet anytime outside the breeding season. And that one little chit-chit call has to perform several functions. First of all, it has to be a contact call that keeps flocks together and lets flock mates know where the other birds are so nobody gets lost. But it also has to warn of danger. And in fact, if the flock encounters like a screech owl or something sitting out on a limb, then that same call might serve to recruit other little birds to come and try to mob the owl and drive it away. So how do the other birds know which of those meanings is intended when a little ruby-crowned kinglet says, chit, chit, it? The answer is context, the same as with human language. So the other birds will pay attention to the context. They will pay attention to whether that ruby-crowned kinglet seems agitated, whether his little red crest is puffed up, whether he's moving really fast or moving slowly, whether he's foraging calmly. They will pay attention to whether they can see any danger in the area or whether they can see an owl. And based on that, they will pay attention, they will determine which of the possible meanings is intended by that one sound. Like I said, this shouldn't be too surprising because it's the same way that we humans do it. But if in bird language, sometimes one sound can have many meanings, it's also true that among birds, sometimes one meaning can have many sounds. And to illustrate this fact, we're going to pull up the bird that, as far as we know, has the largest vocabulary of any bird in the world. That little caveat, as far as we know, that's a big caveat. As I mentioned earlier in the talk, there's actually very few bird species in the world that have been really well studied in terms of their vocal communication. So there could very well be birds out there that have larger vocabularies than the one I'm about to show you. But as far as we've been able to tell so far, this is the bird species with the largest repertoire in the world. And it is a bird that I believe you can find in Florida. It's not the mockingbird, surprisingly. There is a bird that actually has a vocabulary on average that's 10 times larger than a mockingbird's. It's a relative of the mockingbird. It's the brown thrasher. Now, you may be familiar with the brown thrasher's song. They sing a phrase that usually lasts about 1 second, and then they pause for about 1 second, and then they sing a different phrase for about 1 second, and then they pause for about 1 second, and then they sing a different phrase for 1 second, and then they pause for about 1 second. And this goes on and on and on. And it sounds like this. You just heard a brown thrasher singing for approximately 40 seconds. And in that time, that bird did not repeat a single song phrase. Every single song phrase was unique. Researchers wanted to know, how many song phrases does one brown thrasher know? So a researcher named Donald Kreutzma, who also has written some excellent books about birdsong, back when he was a professor at the University of Massachusetts in the 1980s, he and one of his grad students tried to answer this question. They went out on the campus of the university and they recorded a single male brown thrasher singing for 118 straight minutes. So just under 2 hours of song. Then they took that tape back to the lab and they tried to figure out how many different song phrases the bird had sung during that entire time. They had to use techniques to estimate the answer because they couldn't, it was too mathematically complex to get an actual answer. But their best estimate was that that individual male brown thrasher in his entire vocabulary probably had somewhere between 2,000 and 2,500 different song phrases. Just to put that in perspective, your vocabulary as an adult speaker of English is probably on the order of 25,000 words. So here's a bird that has a vocabulary about 10% the size of yours, and its brain is the size of your fingernail. That's amazing. However, it's possible that brown thrashers are saving some brain space when they're remembering all those words, because as far as we know, every single one of those words in brown thrasher language means the exact same thing. Every single one of those song phrases means, I'm a brown thrasher and I'm looking for someone to share my territory with. which immediately raises the question, why do you need 2,000 different ways to say that? And the short answer is, we have no idea. Science has not figured out the answer to this question yet. The standard answer to why birdsong repertoires might evolve to be quite large is something called sexual selection, also known as female choice. The basic idea would be that sometime in the evolutionary history of brown thrasher, females evolved a preference for males who did not repeat themselves. And therefore, the males who had the larger vocabularies and who could go longer without repeating themselves were the ones who picked up mates and passed on their genes to the next generation. And over time, the vocabularies get larger and larger. There's something tricky about that, though, because I don't think that sexual selection can explain how the vocabulary of the brown thrasher got so big. If you stop to think about it, if you're a female brown thrasher and your job is to figure out whether this male, to decide between two males, one of whom has 2,300 song phrases in his repertoire, and the other of whom has 2,500 song phrases in his repertoire. Think about what it would take for the female to make that distinction. She would have to listen to everything that came out of both of those males' mouths for a period of multiple days. She'd have to remember every single thing that they said so that she could be paying attention to when they started to repeat themselves. And we really don't think that female brown thrashers are putting in that much effort. So why is it that male brown thrashers sing that many songs? Do they actually memorize all those songs, or are they improvising part of the time? Are they making it up part of the time as they go along? We don't know. This is a great example of a really common and widespread bird that has a huge mystery in its song. And if you have brown thrashers in your yard, you could help solve this mystery by recording the brown thrashers and paying attention to the brown thrashers. This is a great example of how much we have to learn still about bird sounds. Now, I told you that in bird sounds, sometimes one sound can have many meanings, and also sometimes one meaning can have many sounds. But it's also true that in bird songs, sometimes it's complicated. And to discuss this, we're going to go back to our friends, the red-winged blackbirds. Only this time, instead of talking about songs, we're going to talk about calls. Now, an individual male red-winged blackbird has between 12 and 20 different calls that he gives that we call alert calls. Most of them sound something like chuck, and a couple of them usually sound like whistles, something like seer. And that individual male will sit up on his cattail stalk and he will just give one of those 12 to 20 different alert calls that he knows. He'll give it over and over and over. Here are what some of the alert calls might sound like in a male red-winged blackbird. Now there's 10 different alert calls from a male red-winged blackbird. That might be half of that individual male's alert call vocabulary. Whatever 12 to 20 alert calls that male knows, the other males in his marsh know the same 12 to 20 calls. They all share a vocabulary within a given marsh. But if you drive 30, 40, 50 miles down the road to another marsh, you will find that all the male red-winged blackbirds in that other marsh also share a vocabulary with each other, but they have a different set of alert calls than the males that are farther away. So in a given spot, the males tend to agree on which 12 to 20 alert calls they're going to use. What happens is that if you're out there in the marsh, and you'll be able to hear this if you go out in the marsh next time you're paying attention. During the breeding season, the males will sit up on their stalks, and they'll give one. They'll pick one of these 12 to 20 calls, and they'll give it over and over again. All of them will give the same call out of their repertoire of 12 to 20. And they'll just, each individual male will give that same call over and over again, and the whole marsh will be giving the same call at the same time. Researchers noticed that when danger appeared in the marsh, the calls would change. And this suggested a reason why red-winged blackbirds have 12 to 20 different alert calls. Researchers thought maybe those 12 to 20 different calls send different messages. Maybe they encode the identity of the threat. So maybe there's different calls for hawks and different calls for weasels and different calls for cats and different calls for human beings, etc. Maybe it tells about the type of danger, or maybe it talks about the direction that the danger is coming from, or maybe it talks about how threatening the danger is, the level of the threat, the intensity level. The researchers wanted to get to the bottom of this, so they bought themselves a stuffed Cooper's hawk, and they put it on a stick. And then they got themselves a bed sheet and a really, really long string, so that they could go out in the marsh with this stuffed Cooper's hawk on a stick. They could stick it in the marsh. They could put the bed sheet over the hawk and then retreat a great distance away with the other end of the string, so that when they wanted, they could use the string to whip that bed sheet off. And from the perspective of the male red-winged blackbird, it would be like a Cooper's hawk suddenly appeared right in front of his favorite perch. And they would record the calls that the male red-winged blackbirds were giving before and after the hawk appeared. So they ran this experiment. Let's just say that before the hawk appeared, all the males were giving this call. One male gives it, all the males repeat it. The researchers whip that bed sheet off. The hawk appeared. And the call switches. What happens is, as soon as danger appears, the first male red-winged blackbird to notice the danger switches to a different call, and then all the other males in the marsh immediately switch to that same call. So the researchers thought, well, maybe that might be the hawk call. So they did the same experiment again. Before the bed sheet comes off, let's say all the males are giving this call. Then they whip that bed sheet off. And the males switch to that call. So the researchers decide to try again. Before the bed sheet comes off, all the males, let's say, are giving this call. Then the hawk appears. And they switch to that one. As they did this experiment over and over again, what they learned is that it doesn't matter which call the male red-winged blackbirds switch to when the hawk appears. What matters is that they switch calls. In other words, it is the switch in calls from one to another that carries the message. Any call repeated over and over again in red-winged blackbird language means all clear. And any switch from one call to another means danger. This is a language where the individual words have no meaning at all. And all of the meaning is encoded in the syntax, that is, in the relationship of that that word to the words around it in time. When I learned about this, it blew my mind. I love this example because it taught me that bird sounds can be so much more amazing and unexpected than we often think. We're so used to thinking that bird languages must work the same as human languages, and that's just not the case. I said earlier in the talk tonight that we can learn the language of the birds, but there is not one language of the birds. There are 10,000 different bird languages. Every species on Earth has its own language. And every species on Earth has found its own solutions to the problem of how it's going to communicate with other birds vocally. I love this example of the red-winged blackbird calls because it reminds me to keep a really open mind about the many different ways that bird sounds can communicate messages, even if they're very, very different from the way we do it. So that brings me to the book that I wrote, the Peterson Field Guide to Bird Sounds. There's the Eastern Guide and the Western Guide. I wrote them because I was trying to create a dictionary for the language of the birds. So naturally, you can go to this book and try to figure out what each species is saying. As I mentioned earlier in the talk, we actually don't know a lot about what every species is saying because a lot of species have never been really well studied. So the words "more study needed" appears over and over and over again, hundreds of times in this book. But that's exciting to me rather than frustrating because it means there's so much more that we can learn, I can learn, and that you can help us learn. Another goal of mine when I wrote these books was that I wanted to provide a standard vocabulary for sounds. In other words, I wanted to make sure that when we talk about what we're hearing, we're all using the same terminology. We have a shared terminology to describe what birds look like. We all agree on the names of the colors. We all agree on the names of the parts of the bird. We all agree on the names of the visual patterns. For example, the difference between a spot and a stripe. This is vocabulary that we all learn when we become interested in birds. And in fact, a lot of this vocabulary is laid out at the start of every bird field guide. They have the parts of the bird all labeled. There's no reason why we can't learn a standard vocabulary for sounds. It's just that nobody has standardized such a vocabulary yet. So that's what I tried to do. I tried not to invent too many new words. I tried to take words that people were already using to describe what they were hearing and define them more precisely and more systematically. My book also allows you to compare similar sounding species. So if you go in to any page on the book and look at a sound, down in the lower right-hand corner of the spectrogram, you will see a couple of page numbers. And those page numbers lead you to an index in the back where there will be a list of other birds that sound similar to the one that you're looking at. So for example, if you're hearing something and it sounds kind of like a red-winged blackbird, but maybe not exactly, you could go to the red-winged blackbird page and say, what's the index? What other birds might sound like that? And you could get a quick list. And that allows you to look up a bird sound that you don't know. That's super exciting. On the inside back cover of the field guide, there is this quick index. And it asks you, what did you hear? Over here on the left, this left-hand column, these are all the single notes. If you heard a single note, you can kind of look through this description to see which one best describes what you heard. This second column is the same note repeated over and over again. And then here on the right, you have all the more complicated types of songs. And you'll notice that these little descriptions lead to page numbers in the index where you will find lists of birds that sound like that, that then can lead you back to the species accounts. And of course, nowadays, we have apps on our phone that are very, very exciting and can do really cool stuff. One that I like to use is called Song Sleuth. It's a free app. It's one I'm not affiliated with. But if you download Song Sleuth on your phone, and you can get it either for Android or iPhone, you can actually record bird sounds. And at the same time that you're recording them, or even if you're not recording them, you can actually see the real-time scrolling spectrogram of everything that your phone is hearing. So this is great because if a bird is singing in the field, you can turn on Song Sleuth, you can hold up your phone, and the bird will sign its name right on your phone. Every species has a distinctive spectrogram. And then you can pause it and you can actually look at it. So you can actually take a picture of the bird sound in the field while the bird is singing. If you got a picture of the sound, then you could pick up my book, The Peterson Field Guide to Bird Sounds, and you could identify the bird by the picture of its sound. You can match a picture to a picture, which is the way that field guides have always worked. So it takes audio identification and makes it visual, which for a lot of us makes it easier. Now, in addition to that, some of us, me included, are losing our high-pitched hearing. Unfortunately, high-pitched hearing loss runs in my family, so I don't hear high-pitched birds very well at all anymore. My phone has a better ear than I do. So sometimes when I'm hearing just a partial bird sound and I'm missing part of it, I can get out my spectrogram on my phone and have the whole sound illustrated for me, and I can see the parts that I can't hear, and it makes it a lot easier for me to identify what I'm hearing. There are also now apps, including Song Sleuth, that attempt to identify the birds for you. The best one now is called Merlin Sound ID. It's part of the Merlin app, which is free for download from the Cornell Laboratory of Ornithology. Many of you may already have Merlin on your phone. It's basically an electronic field guide, but now there's a part that you can download that will identify sounds for you. It's not foolproof, but it's currently the best one that's out there. And the nice thing about Merlin is that unlike Song Sleuth or Bird Genie or some of these other apps, you can just hold up the phone and Merlin keeps listening every 3 seconds to what it's hearing. And if it hears a bird that it recognizes, it'll pop the name of the bird up on your screen. And then if it hears another bird it recognizes, it'll pop the name of that bird up below the first one. So eventually, like if you're sitting there and there's a cardinal singing and a Carolina wren singing and also a mockingbird, Merlin will just pop those names up. It'll say cardinal, Carolina wren, mockingbird, and then it'll turn the name of the bird yellow every time it recognizes that bird singing, which is really cool. I should also mention that in conjunction with my book, there is a website where you can go and listen to a whole bunch of bird sounds from the book. It's Petersonbirdsoundscom. And if you go there, it will redirect you to this site hosted by the Cornell Lab. You can type in the name of any species, and then it'll show you a whole bunch of different songs and calls from that species. And then you can click play on any of them, and it will show you the spectrogram, and it will scroll the spectrogram on your screen as the recording plays so that you can watch the spectrogram and listen to it at the exact same time, which is a wonderful way to start learning how to read spectrograms and figuring out what different sounds actually look like on the screen. This collection of bird sounds is totally free. No purchase of the book is necessary. Anybody can go there and listen to it. If I say so myself, it is the best curated and most complete collection of bird sounds ever assembled for North American birds. Unfortunately, you cannot download the sounds. You can only listen to them streaming online. So you do need a data connection on your phone in order to use the site. That is my talk tonight. And I will be very happy now to answer any questions that you may have. I think we have a question and answer button down at the bottom of our Zoom webinar, or it might be up at the top, depending on how you have your screen set up. And I think you can put your questions in there.
Nathan, you've done a wonderful job, but you know, birds like humans have different languages, and when we take English to some places, it turns into other kinds of dialects and things. Is that happening with birds?
That absolutely does happen with birds, yes. So I referred to that a little bit when I talked about how all the red-winged blackbirds in one marsh are going to agree on the alert calls. They're going to have the same collection of alert calls that they all know. But then if you drive 30 miles, 40 miles down the road and listen to the red-winged blackbirds in a different marsh, they're going to have a different collection of alert calls. And the same thing happens with most bird songs. Any bird songs that are learned, what happens is that once in a while, a bird will learn a song slightly differently, or it'll change a note here or there accidentally or on purpose. And then it passes that difference in song on to the next generation. And so over time, you develop these slight differences among different regions. And it's just the same as having a different accent or a different dialect when you go to a different place in human language. That happens all the time. So most of the songbirds, most of the birds in the second half of the field guide, everything after the flycatchers, they typically have regional dialects. And you'll hear differences if you move from bird to bird. There's also a lot of individual birds. And as we talked about, some birds, the individuals know many songs. So that's also part of the variation as well. Yeah, and I can see the questions that are both in the chat, and I can see some questions in the Q&A. I see one question in the Q&A. So I'll go ahead and start answering some of those. So I see Jim's question: can different bird species communicate? In other words, can bird species communicate across the species barrier? The answer is mostly they would ignore each other, because most bird species most of the time have nothing to say to one another. When a brown thrasher is singing, he is saying, "I'm a male brown thrasher, I'm looking for a female brown thrasher mate." The Carolina wrens have, they might hear it, but they're not going to pay any attention to that. There's nothing for them that makes any sense there. However, one of the key differences is alarm calls. A lot of species will recognize the alarm calls of other species because it's very beneficial if everybody in the neighborhood gets alerted when a hawk or another predator appears. So you can play, if you're at your feeder and one of the birds, there's a whole bunch of birds at your feeder and one of the birds sees a hawk, it'll give an alarm call in its own language. And a lot of times all the birds of all the species will scatter when that happens, because they've learned, you know, the wrens and the robins have learned to listen to the blue jays because, and vice versa, because the more eyes on the sky, the better. Curtis asked, do many birds have what you called flight songs? The answer is yes. Many warblers and sparrows have flight songs that are different from their typical songs that are usually given in flight. So it's many warblers, many sparrows, many flycatchers also have specific flight songs that are different from their perched songs. And then red-winged blackbirds, yellow-headed blackbirds. There's a few others. That's most of the ones in North America that have flight songs. But most birds don't necessarily have different songs that they give in flight. So if most songs are given in flight, they're the same song as the perched song.
Are those the same as migratory songs? Or is there any migratory songs?
No, flights, what we would call flight songs tend, not in red-winged blackbirds. Blackbirds are a different thing. The flight songs in different groups of birds probably serve different purposes. But for example, in warblers and in sparrows, and possibly in flycatchers, flight songs tend to be, we think that they tend to be given very rarely, and we think that they're probably for some kind of like high intensity courtship or maybe high intensity territorial defense. You don't get those flight songs very often in most of those birds. They tend to be more complicated and longer than the typical songs. So it's a little bit confusing as to exactly what they're all about, but they're not given in migration the way that flight calls might be at night. They're a whole different thing. I see a question from Kathy asking, do mockingbirds actually imitate other bird songs? The answer is yes, they absolutely do. They listen to the other birds around them and then they imitate those songs. Now, the question of why they imitate those songs is a little bit harder to answer. I can tell you what they're not trying to do. They're not mimicking other birds. We use the word mimicry in biology for a specific thing, and it's not what mockingbirds are doing, or starlings, or other birds that imitate. Mimicry in biology is when one animal evolves to look like or sound like another animal, so that it can be mistaken for that animal, because there's some kind of evolutionary advantage to doing that. So that's why the viceroy butterfly looks like the monarch butterfly, because the monarch is poisonous. So it's advantageous for the viceroy to look like it's poisonous too, even though it's not. That's mimicry. Imitation among bird sounds, the mockingbirds do not. If a mockingbird is imitating a Carolina wren, the last thing that mockingbird wants is to be mistaken for a Carolina wren. Because if a mockingbird is mistaken for a Carolina wren, two bad things would happen. One is that all the other mockingbirds would ignore it. And two is that all the other Carolina wrens in the area would get angry and attack it. The mockingbird does not want either of those things to happen. So even though it imitates a Carolina wren very, very well, what it does is it always gives that song in mockingbird pattern, meaning that it'll give the wren song a couple times in a row really fast, and then it'll switch to a different song that it'll give a few times in a row really fast. And then it'll switch to a different song that it'll give a couple of times in a row really fast. That's how you and I recognize that it's actually a mockingbird instead of a Carolina wren. And that's how the Carolina wrens and the other mockingbirds recognize too. So what mockingbirds are actually doing, I think, is similar to what human artists do when they sample a bit of another artist's song. They hear something they like, they take a little bit of it and they put it into their own song, but they want to put their own spin on it so that nobody mistakes it for the original song. That's what mockingbirds are doing when they're imitating other birds.
What is your favorite song?
What is my favorite song? My favorite song is the song of a bird that lives only in Mexico, and it is called the slate-colored solitaire. And I don't have it super available for you right now to listen to, but you can listen to it on the web, various places. If you listen to the slate-colored solitaire, it's my favorite bird sound. It's a wonderful sound from the cloud forest in Mexico.
Do like hawks, the different hawks, is there a related, are the sounds kind of related to one another, or are they just totally different? Did they evolve? I was kind of wondering.
Well, since hawks are closely related, you would expect them to have evolved from a common ancestor, and therefore you would expect them to look similar, you would expect them to sound similar. And you can tell that all hawks are related because they look very similar. A lot of hawks sound fairly similar as well. you typically get two different kinds of calls from hawks, like the scream of the red tail, kiar, or else that kind of series call that you get from red-shouldered hawks, the clear, 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 over and over again. Most of the hawks in North America give something that's kind of similar to one of those two types of sounds. And then
like
more distantly related ones give more distantly related calls.
sort of out with owls too.
It's the same with owls. It's the same with a lot of different birds. Yep,
Right.
absolutely. I see that's related to a question that Terry asked in the Q&A. Do hawks give a hunting call or a territorial call when hunting? Red-shouldered hawks call frequently while hunting in Florida. Most hawks don't. They might call while they're hunting, but they're not calling because they're hunting, if that makes sense. They don't have a specific call that means I'm hunting. Most hawks and owls and things are not going to want to make a lot of sound when they're hunting because they don't want to scare their prey away. They don't want to alert their prey that they're hunting. There are a couple of exceptions, like, for example, Harris's hawks in sometimes hunt cooperatively. They sometimes hunt in groups. They may call to one another to kind of coordinate while they're hunting in groups. But other than that, most hawks, if they do call while they're hunting, it's probably because they're also doing something else. They're probably multitasking there. I see another another question from Donna in the chat. Morning songs seem to me to be the most beautiful. I've read in literature that authors refer to this as early matins, a French word there. Do you have a comment on this? I'm unfamiliar with the term early matins, but a lot of people call it the dawn chorus or dawn songs. There are, just like a number of birds have special songs that they only give in flight, many birds also have special songs that they only give at the crack of dawn or before first light. Examples of this would be barn swallows, tree swallows, purple martins. Those birds all have special dawn songs that you don't hear at other times of day. Many species of flycatcher, such as eastern kingbird. Eastern kingbird has a dawn song. Most kingbirds, in fact, I think all kingbirds have dawn songs that they only give, or almost only give, first thing in the morning and not later in the day. And there are a few other kinds of birds that have specific dawn songs. So that's interesting, and we don't entirely know why that is. Even birds that don't sing different songs at dawn, they tend to sing more vigorously at dawn. And there's various theories on why that is, but I don't think we have an exact answer there. I got a request in the chat to repeat the name of the Mexican bird whose sound I like. So I'll say my favorite bird song is the slate-colored solitaire. And I have just put that in the chat so that if you have the chat open, you should be able to see the name of that bird there. And you can look for it and listen to it if you want on a website such as xenocanto.org, a good website for listening to bird sounds. I just put that in the chat as well. I see a question here from Dumavati. Is there a brief way to explain how birds produce their songs? Thinking that they don't have vocal cords per se, but I'm not sure how it works. Indeed, they do not have vocal cords. The vocal organ of a bird is very different from your and my vocal organ. We have what's called a larynx. It's up here in the throat. And you and I can only sing one sound at a time. A bird's vocal organ is located much farther down inside the chest at the Y junction where the trachea splits into two bronchi, one to go to each lung. At that Y junction is this organ called a syrinx, which is a bird's vocal organ. And there's a sound producing membrane in each bronchus, meaning that there's literally two different voices, one controlled by each lung. Every single bird has two voices. They can literally sing two different notes at the same time. They can duet with themselves or harmonize with themselves. All birds have this basic ability, but most birds actually never use it. Most birds either just sing with one side of their syrinx their whole lives and they never use the other side. Or what some birds do is they'll sing the high notes in their song with one side of their syrinx and the low notes in their song with the other side of their syrinx. But some birds actually sing with both syrinxes at the same time, both sides of the syrinx at the same time. And they actually sing duets with themselves. And when they do that, it's called a polyphonic sound. And with practice, you can actually learn to tell when a bird is doing that. I can tell by ear when a bird is doing that. It took me a while to learn that, but now that I have learned that, I can tell when a bird is singing with both sides of its syrinx at the same time. It has a distinctive tone quality when that happens. In North America, the birds that do this are primarily in three families. It's mostly the thrushes, the icterids, that's the blackbirds and the meadowlarks and the orioles, and the finches, goldfinches, house finches, etc. Those three families are really fond of singing with both sides of their syrinx at the same time. Gnatcatchers will do it as well, and blue-gray gnatcatcher anyway. And other than that, there's not too many birds that do it too often in the United States. Those are the main ones.
Interesting.
All right.
I was born in Minnesota and I really like the loons. and that really travels across the lakes. You can hear them, and it seems like they have a few extra calls too. And I suppose during the mating season and other times, when they come down here to Florida, they don't ever make any sound. As you indicated, the other birds do that same thing. But
They must have a melodious song, though. How do you, big lungs?
Loons are wonderful. I love going up to Minnesota and hearing the loons up there on the lakes. And I do wish they would sing on the wintering grounds on the ocean, but they typically don't. Yeah,
that's too bad, because we see them down here in the wintertime, but they don't sing for us normally. Yeah, very good. But when I go out to pick up the paper in the morning, the blue jays, the first blue jay notices I'm walking down, and then they've got about 5 or 6 blue jays, and they just seem singing back and forth, letting everybody know that I'm walking down that trail. Other than that, they seem to be quiet.
That could be exactly what they're doing. Blue jays and crows and other corvids have very, very complicated vocal communication, and we have not cracked their code yet. They're very smart birds. They probably know exactly who you are and where you are, and they remember you, and they might be telling other birds that you're there.
Right. Is that finished up the questions?
I don't see any more questions either in the chat or in the Q&A.
Very good.
Well, thank you very, very much. Great talk. I'm so glad that we're going to get this on recording this, because one person I noticed on the chat said, I want to hear this again, talk. And there's a lot of information that you've given, and I think it'll be good that people want to get back and see it again. So I appreciate you allowing us to do that. And thank you so much for coming on Zoom and doing this talk. You're terrific, and I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Does your book have some audio?
My book does have audio. It's at Petersonbirdsounds.com.
All right, fabulous.
So thank you. And I guess we'll close this meeting down and appreciate everybody attending. And I think we're going to listen to these sounds a little bit more with a little different meaning to them. So
It opens a new world for us. Thank you.
Thank you so much.